The courtroom was alive with the sounds of rustling papers and murmured conversations as Judge Robert Winters sat at his elevated bench, scanning the docket in front of him. The atmosphere was familiar, the way it always felt during morning proceedings, routine business for most, but today there was something in the air that felt different. Even though the room seemed like any other court session, Marissa Harris could sense it the moment she stepped inside. She adjusted her blazer, straightened her posture, and moved toward the front, her heels clicking with purpose on the polished floor. She had been here before, but this time it felt unfamiliar. She had dealt with judges and lawyers many times before, all of them different in their demeanor, some kind, some condescending, but each in their own way, acting as gatekeepers to a system she was determined to change. Judge Winters was known for his strictness and no-nonsense approach to every case, no exceptions, no leniency. He ran his courtroom like a well-oiled machine, and it worked for him. His reputation for being unyielding was a part of his identity. His presence alone commanded respect. There was an air of superiority that followed him wherever he went, and it was a trait that had earned him both admiration and criticism. Marissa had done everything she could to rise above the stereotypes and biases that followed her. She had worked tirelessly to prove her worth in a system designed to overlook people like her. But here she was once again standing in front of someone who couldn't see past his own assumptions. She knew how this would play out, but still she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered in her chest. Judge Winters called the case with a quick flick of his wrist. His voice, deep and commanding, echoed through the room as he looked down at the paper in front of him. Without even lifting his eyes to acknowledge her, Marissa Harris, he said matter-of-factly, without a hint of recognition or warmth. She stood at attention as he rattled off the details of her case, a minor traffic infraction, nothing serious, but that didn't seem to matter to him, not today. Her explanation was calm and logical. She spoke clearly, but the judge barely seemed to listen, her words hanging in the air as he scribbled something on his pad. Without making eye contact, the more she spoke, the more she felt herself being dismissed. The sense that she was just another face in the crowd started to settle in. Without giving her a chance to elaborate or even finish her sentence, Winters glanced at his notes and made his decision immediately. A fine, he declared, his voice cutting through the silence like a gavel striking wood. The room seemed to hold its breath as he delivered his ruling in a clipped tone. No room for negotiation, no room for argument. Marissa nodded stiffly, her lips pressing into a thin line. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she kept it in check. She had learned long ago how to keep her emotions at bay. She was used to being underestimated, but this felt different today. It was more than just a dismissal, it felt personal. She turned and walked away from the bench, her steps measured, but her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't shake. Why had he been so quick to decide? Why had he been so harsh? She didn't know him, but somehow it felt like he knew nothing about her at all. And she couldn't help but wonder if he had any idea who she really was. Marissa Harris stepped out of the courtroom and into the bright hallway, the click of her heels reverberating against the marble floors. The weight of the fine pressed against her chest, but it wasn't the penalty itself that bothered her. It was the feeling of being dismissed once again, of being seen as just another person to be processed through the system, another name on a list. She exhaled sharply as she reached the elevator, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of the button panel. Before she pressed it, she stood there for a moment, staring at her reflection in the polished surface of the elevator doors, wondering if today would be the day she would let herself feel frustrated or angry. But she knew better than that. She had worked too hard to let emotions cloud her judgment. Marissa's story wasn't one of privilege or ease. It was one forged in the fire of challenges that many of her peers would never have to face. She had grown up in a modest neighborhood, raised by a single mother who worked long hours as a nurse trying to make ends meet. Marissa had always been the driven one. Even as a child, she had a hunger for knowledge, a thirst for success that her mother had always supported. But she knew that the world outside their small home would not give her the same chance as others. She had attended one of the best law schools in the country on scholarship, but even there she was acutely aware of the small space she occupied in a predominantly white and male-dominated field. She had learned quickly that she had to work twice as hard to prove herself, just to be seen, and even then it wasn't always enough. But Marissa wasn't the type to back down. Her determination and intelligence had driven her to excel despite the odds, and now she was one of the youngest people to hold a senior position in the city's legal department. She was in charge of overseeing policies that would influence the way the city's judicial system ran, and that meant she had a unique opportunity to make real change. Her role required a level of diplomacy and strategy that few understood, but it was something she excelled at. She had earned the respect of those around her through years of hard work and perseverance, yet despite all her accomplishments, there were still moments like today when she was reminded of how quickly others were to dismiss her based on assumptions about who she was and where she came from. The elevator dinged and the doors slid open. She stepped inside and pressed the button for the top floor. Her mind still racing from the courtroom encounter, she knew that she couldn't let something like this distract her. But it wasn't easy. She thought about the countless other women and people of color who had been through the same thing and who might never get the chance to confront their biases like she had. As the elevator ascended, Marissa thought about her position and the responsibility it carried. She was no longer just a rising star in the system. She was a leader, someone who could make a difference for others who didn't have the same opportunities she had been given, and that thought brought her some peace, but also more determination. She would find a way to address this, to use her position to challenge the very biases that had led to her own treatment today. The elevator doors opened and she stepped out into the hallway of her office, building the quiet buzz of conversation and the low hum of fluorescent lights filling the air. As she walked toward her office, Marissa knew she had a long road ahead of her, but she was ready to face it head-on. Marissa sat at her sleek glass desk, her fingers drumming restlessly against the surface. The city skyline stretched out before her, the sunlight glinting off the buildings, but it felt distant, as though she were staring through it rather than at it. Her mind kept replaying the moment in the courtroom, the judge's dismissive tone, the quickness with which he handed down the fine. She had thought about it all day. His actions had stirred something in her, something deep and uncomfortable. It wasn't just the fine that bothered her, it was the assumption that she, like so many others, could be treated as a statistic, another faceless person in the sea of cases that passed through his courtroom. She had been calm, respectful, and still she had been disregarded. But there was something else, something she hadn't been able to shake. She pulled the case file up on her computer screen. The words Marissa Harris stared back at her, her name now forever tied to that moment. She clicked through the details, each line confirming the same thing. The fine had been imposed without much consideration, without a second thought. The offense had been minor, yet the penalty was disproportionate. That's when she noticed it, a small detail buried in the case file, one that she had missed when she'd first looked over the papers. The signature. It was handwritten, but not by the clerk who processed the fine. It was the judge's. She froze, staring at the signature. Asterisk, asterisk, Judge Robert Winters, asterisk, asterisk. Her heart skipped. Her hands trembled as she read it again, and then it hit her with a force that almost knocked the wind out of her. The judge who had handed down the fine was someone she now oversaw. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was the head of the city's legal department, and Judge Winters, he was under her jurisdiction. The realization stunned her. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the computer screen, trying to process what that meant. She'd known he was an experienced judge, well established in his field, but she hadn't realized the depth of his influence. Now, the same man who had dismissed her so effortlessly was someone she had the power to oversee. Her mind spun. What was the right move here? Should she address it directly with him? Should she let it slide, chalking it up to a moment of poor judgment? No, this wasn't just about one incident. It was about something deeper. It was about the systems that allowed this to happen, the biases that colored his perception of her before she even spoke a word. Marissa closed the file and leaned forward, hands clasped together, her mind racing with possibilities. She had worked too hard to get to where she was now to let this slide. She knew she had to confront this, professionally, strategically, and firmly. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, pulling her back to the present. There was no going back now. She had to act. She didn't want to be vindictive or petty. That wasn't who she was. But she knew that this wasn't just a personal slight. It was about the broader, more insidious bias that still thrived in the system, a bias that would continue to shape decisions unless it was challenged head-on. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she drafted an email to set up a meeting with Judge Winters. The words were carefully chosen, clear, direct, but polite. She had no intention of being confrontational, but she would not let this go unanswered. She was determined to make him aware of his blind spots, not just as a judge, but as someone who now had to answer to her. As she hit send, a sense of calm settled over her. The ball was now in his court. The meeting would happen, and when it did, there would be no room for misunderstanding. She wasn't just a name on a case file. She was the future of this system, and she was determined to make sure it was one where people like her could no longer be overlooked. The meeting was set for the following afternoon, and Marissa felt a mix of anticipation and resolve as she walked into the courthouse building. She had been here countless times before, meeting with colleagues, strategizing about policies, sitting in on legal reviews. But today was different. Today, she wasn't just another lawyer, another administrator. Today, she was the one who had been wrong, the one in a position to confront the system, to challenge its assumptions. Marissa stepped off the elevator and walked down the familiar marble corridor toward Judge Winter's office. She made sure to keep the meeting private, wanting to approach it with the professionalism she knew the situation warranted. She wasn't there to make a scene. She was there to address something far more important. When she reached the door, she paused for a brief moment, straightening her posture and taking a deep breath. She wasn't nervous. She hadn't been nervous in a long time, but there was a quiet anticipation. She knew how this could go. The judge could be defensive. He could dismiss her, or he could simply brush it aside. But she also knew that he might just surprise her. She wasn't going to assume the worst, but neither was she naive. She knocked twice and heard a deep voice call out from inside. "Come in." Judge Winter's office was what one might expect, sleek, sterile, with dark wood paneling that matched the air of authority he exuded. His desk was impeccably tidy, a few files stacked neatly to one side, a family photo sitting proudly at the corner. As she stepped inside, he was standing, holding a cup of coffee, his expression somewhere between friendly and professional. But there was something off about it. A slight wariness, perhaps, or maybe a recognition of what this conversation was likely going to be. "Miss Harris," he said with a slight nod, setting his coffee down and gesturing for her to take a seat. "Judge Winters," she replied, her voice steady, but the words felt like a calculated weight, her mind already running through everything she needed to say. There was an awkward pause before Marissa broke it, choosing to cut to the chase, not wanting to dance around the issue. "I'm sure you've realized by now that I'm not here because of your rulings today," she began. "I'm here because of a personal experience I had in your courtroom." The judge raised an eyebrow, the polite smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I'm not sure I follow." Marissa didn't hesitate. "You fined me during a traffic hearing just a few days ago, Judge Winters, and I understand that's part of your role, but what you don't know, what you didn't realize, is that I'm now in a position where I oversee decisions like yours." The words hung in the air for a moment, and for a fraction of a second, Marissa could see the flicker of realization in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come right away. Instead, he settled back into his chair, eyes narrowing slightly as he processed her statement. "I see," he said, his voice softer now, almost reluctant. "I didn't know." "Obviously," she replied, her tone not harsh but firm. "But now you do." Another moment of silence passed, and Marissa watched as he took a deep breath, clearly considering his next words carefully. His face softened, as if some of the walls he'd built over the years were starting to crack. "Look, Ms. Harris, I didn't mean to." He began, but Marissa raised her hand to stop him. "I know you didn't mean to," she interrupted gently. "But I need to make this clear. It's not just about this case. It's about the way these decisions are made every day in courts like yours. The assumptions, the biases that influence judgments without anyone even realizing it. And it's about me, about the fact that people like me don't get the same leeway as others. You didn't see me. You didn't hear me. You judged me based on whatever you assumed I was." She didn't say it with anger, though she felt the fire of her words. She said it with a quiet certainty, as though she had spoken these truths to herself 100 times before, and now they had found their voice. For a long moment, Judge Winters said nothing. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Marissa could sense the internal struggle. He had clearly never been confronted like this, not directly, not so personally. He had probably lived most of his life as a man who believed in the fairness of his rulings. But now she could see that the veneer of his certainties was beginning to crack. Finally, he spoke, his voice a little softer, a little more hesitant than before. "I'll be honest, Miss Harris, I've never really thought about it like that." Marissa nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I understand, but that's the problem. People like me have to constantly think about it, and that needs to change." The silence that followed was thick with the weight of that truth. Neither of them spoke for a while, but there was something in the room that had shifted, a mutual understanding forming in the space between them. It wasn't resolution, not yet, but it was a beginning that neither of them had expected. And in that quiet moment, Marissa knew that the conversation had only just started. The days that followed the meeting with Judge Winters felt strangely quiet, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Marissa returned to her usual responsibilities, but her mind continued to revisit that conversation, replaying the judge's softening demeanor, his words, and his reaction to her. There was something undeniably human about the way he had listened, the way he had allowed himself to feel the weight of her words. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from settled. Marissa had worked too long and too hard to get where she was, too long to let this moment slip by without deeper reflection. The truth was, this wasn't just about a single judge or a single fine. It was about a much larger system, one that often failed to see beyond its own biases, its own assumptions, and its own historical patterns. Over the next week, the fallout from the meeting began to unfold in ways Marissa hadn't anticipated. Her colleagues, some of whom had overheard rumors of the encounter, began to look at her differently. Some with admiration, others with uncertainty, and a few with a quiet sense of skepticism. It was clear that the meeting had sparked something, not just in Marissa, but in the entire legal department. In some ways, Marissa felt the weight of it. She wasn't just leading a team, she was leading a revolution. The ideas she championed were not merely about policy reform. They were about challenging systems that had been in place for generations, and she was acutely aware that pushing for change often came with a price. The judge's apology, though sincere, had done little to quell the questions now swirling in her department. Some of her colleagues were supportive, others unsure. One particularly vocal member of her team, a senior attorney named Karen, had even approached her a few days after the meeting to express her concerns. "I just don't know if it's a good idea to make it so public," Karen said, her arms crossed as she leaned against the doorframe of Marissa's office. "You're talking about a senior judge. His reputation is, well, it's well established. Challenging him like that might create unnecessary friction." Marissa looked up from her desk, her expression thoughtful but firm. "Karen, this isn't about personal conflict. This is about systems that need to change. We can't ignore these things because they make us uncomfortable. If we don't address it now, nothing changes." "I understand," Karen replied, her tone softening. "But you know how this works. You don't always get to choose when or how change happens. People are watching you, Marissa. Some of them don't like what you're doing, and that could come back to haunt you." Marissa didn't respond immediately. She sat back in her chair, letting the weight of Karen's words sink in. The truth was, Karen was right. Change was hard, especially when it felt like the entire establishment was working against it. But Marissa had never shied away from difficult challenges. She had earned her place, and she wasn't going to back down now. A few days later, Judge Winters reached out again. This time, it wasn't just a casual follow-up. His email was more formal, requesting a meeting to discuss potential improvements to the department's ongoing efforts to address biases within the legal system. Marissa read it over several times, unsure whether to feel relieved or apprehensive. She replied, agreeing to the meeting, but with a new sense of purpose. She had already proven that she wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right, but now it was time to take this conversation further. This wasn't about a single fine or a single judge anymore. It was about creating a ripple effect, one that could challenge not just the courtrooms, but the entire system from the inside out. Her phone buzzed with a notification, breaking her thoughts. The message was from her assistant, confirming the time for the meeting. Marissa smiled slightly, a quiet resolve settling over her. It was time to push forward, to take what had been an uncomfortable conversation and turn it into something that could drive real change. She wasn't just going to be a passive observer in this system anymore. She was going to be the one shaping it. The meeting with Judge Winters was scheduled for late afternoon in a conference room at the legal department's headquarters. Marissa arrived early, the weight of the moment settling heavily on her shoulders. She had spent the entire morning preparing, reviewing case files, drafting notes, and rehearsing her talking points. But despite her meticulous preparation, there was still a lingering feeling of uncertainty. This meeting felt different. It wasn't just about legal strategy or policy recommendations. It was about a reckoning, about changing the course of a system that had, for too long, operated without question. The conference room, with its long mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows, was designed for high-level discussions. As Marissa waited, she glanced out at the city skyline, the golden light of the setting sun bathing everything in a soft glow. She couldn't help but wonder how much longer the world would continue to turn a blind eye to the injustices that plagued the system. Judge Winters arrived right on time, dressed in his usual tailored suit, his expression composed but tinged with a hint of tension. His handshake was firm, his eyes a little more focused than before. Marissa could tell that the past few days had caused him to reflect. He wasn't the same judge who had been dismissive and quick to judge her in court, but there was still something guarded about him. This wasn't a casual conversation. There was a lot at stake. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me again, Ms. Harris," he said, sitting across from her at the table. "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation." Marissa nodded, her eyes steady. "I appreciate that, Judge Winters, and I think it's important we continue this dialogue. This is bigger than one incident. It's about a pattern of decision-making that often goes unchecked, and how it affects people like me, and people who don't have the same access or opportunities." He leaned back in his chair, taking a moment before speaking. "I admit, I didn't fully grasp the depth of your concerns last time. I've been listening to others, reading more, and trying to understand how biases like mine manifest in the courtroom. I can see that you're right. There's more to this than I realized." Marissa's gaze didn't waver. "It's not just about the biases we recognize, Judge. It's about the ones that are embedded in the system, unseen, unspoken, but powerful all the same. You made an assumption about me based on your own experiences, and that's something that happens every day to people who look like me. But the real question is, what are we going to do about it?" He exhaled slowly, as if the weight of her words had settled on his shoulders. "I don't know. I've spent my career thinking I've done what's right, but I can see now that right isn't always fair. I don't want to be part of the problem. I want to help fix it." Marissa's eyes softened, though her tone remained firm. "Fixing it requires more than just good intentions. It requires action. We need to address this at the core. We need more diverse perspectives in our legal processes. We need training that goes beyond surface-level sensitivity. And we need to start holding ourselves accountable for the biases we unknowingly perpetuate." Judge Winters nodded slowly, his brow furrowing as he processed her words. "You're right. It's easy to assume we're doing the right thing when we've been doing it the same way for so long. But I'm willing to listen to learn. What do you suggest we do first?" Marissa paused, taking a deep breath. She had anticipated this question, but hearing him ask it made her feel a sense of both excitement and responsibility. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. She had a chance to reshape the narrative, to take her experience and turn it into something that could benefit countless others. "We start by creating a task force," she said, her voice steady and clear. "A task force dedicated to reviewing current judicial practices and policies. One that is inclusive, transparent, and focused on identifying systemic biases. We also begin mandatory bias training for judges and legal professionals, something that goes beyond just an hour-long seminar. And we ensure that these initiatives aren't just one-time efforts, but an ongoing commitment to change. Judge Winters listened intently, his fingers tapping lightly on the table as he processed her suggestions. "That's a bold plan," he said after a moment, "but I'm willing to help make it happen." Marissa allowed herself a small smile. "It's not just about one person, Judge. It's about all of us. And it's time we start making that change, starting from the top down." For the first time since their meeting had begun, Judge Winters' expression softened, the tension in his face melting into something more genuine. "Then let's get to work," he said. Marissa's heart skipped a beat. She had pushed past the discomfort, the resistance, and had found common ground. The fight for justice was far from over, but in this room, in this moment, she knew they were taking the first real step toward building a better, fairer system. And for the first time in a long while, Marissa felt hopeful. In the weeks that followed, the task force that Marissa and Judge Winters had discussed began to take shape. The response from the legal community was mixed at first. Some praised the idea of addressing systemic bias head-on, while others viewed it as a necessary but uncomfortable step in uncharted territory. Regardless of the skepticism, Marissa was determined to push forward. She had always believed that real change required challenging the status quo, even when it made people uneasy. The task force was comprised of judges, lawyers, diversity experts, and social justice advocates, with Marissa at the helm. She had made sure to include voices from all corners of the legal system, from those in positions of power to those who often went unheard. For her, this was about inclusion, creating a space where the marginalized could speak freely, without fear of reprisal, and where the powerful could listen without defensiveness. The first meeting of the task force was held in a conference room, much like the one where she and Judge Winters had met. This time, however, the stakes felt even higher. The room was filled with tension as the members settled into their seats, their expressions a mix of skepticism, curiosity, and cautious optimism. Marissa stood at the front, a quiet authority in her posture, ready to lay out the vision for what this task force could become. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady. "I know this isn't an easy conversation to have, but it's one we need to have, because we're standing at a crossroads. The legal system has always prided itself on fairness, on being the ultimate arbiter of justice. But the truth is, it's flawed. It's deeply flawed. And unless we start taking concrete steps to address the biases that permeate every decision we make, we'll never be able to create the change we say we want." There was a murmur of agreement around the room, but some faces were still hard to read. Judge Winters, who had taken a seat near the back, gave her a nod of encouragement. Marissa could feel his support, but she also knew that this moment wasn't just about him. It was about making sure everyone in the room understood that this task force was their responsibility, too. "We're going to focus on 3 areas," she continued. "First, we need to identify the systemic biases in our current practices, both implicit and explicit. Second, we're going to establish a comprehensive training program for legal professionals at all levels, so that everyone from judges to clerks understands how to recognize and challenge their own biases. And finally, we're going to build a transparent system of accountability, one that ensures that the changes we implement are not just surface level, but sustainable." She paused, scanning the room. Some were nodding, others still seemed unconvinced, but Marissa wasn't deterred. This was just the beginning. The real work would be in the difficult conversations ahead, the ones that would force people to confront uncomfortable truths. Karen, the senior attorney who had voiced her concerns earlier, spoke up. "This is ambitious, Marissa. You're asking a lot. These are deeply ingrained practices. You can't just expect people to change overnight." "I don't expect change to come easily," Marissa replied. "We don't have the luxury of waiting. We've already waited too long." There was a brief silence as her words settled into the room. Marissa knew that she had made a powerful point. Change wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity, one that had been a long time coming. As the meeting continued, the group began to settle into a rhythm. The conversations were often difficult, at times contentious, but they were also productive. By the end of the first session, they had laid out a rough timeline for the task force's initiatives and a set of goals to measure their progress. Judge Winters, who had been mostly quiet up until this point, stood up just before the meeting concluded. His voice was calm but resolute. "This won't be easy," he said, looking around the room, "and there will be resistance. But I agree with Ms. Harris. This is necessary. We owe it to those we serve to make this system one that's truly just for everyone." Marissa felt a rush of gratitude toward the judge. His endorsement was more than just words. It was a signal that this was no longer just her fight. It was everyone's fight. As the members of the task force filed out of the room, Marissa remained behind for a moment, staring out the window. The city was still bathed in the last light of day, its skyline, a reflection of the complex system she was working to change. She knew it would take time, but for the first time, she felt that the wheels were in motion. The road ahead would be long, but now she felt certain that change was not just possible, it was inevitable. Months passed, and the task force continued its work. The atmosphere within the legal department began to shift. At first, there had been hesitation, even resistance, but as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that the conversations, though difficult, were changing the way people thought. Slowly, the walls of denial and defensiveness began to crumble, replaced by a recognition of the systemic flaws that had long been ignored. Marissa had become a quiet force, guiding the task force through its initiatives with unwavering determination. She coordinated focus groups, held training sessions, and encouraged frank discussions about the biases that lurked in the corners of their practices. She had created a platform where people, judges, clerks, attorneys, and even those who had previously remained silent, felt empowered to speak up and challenge the status quo. The feedback was at times uncomfortable, but it was always constructive. And yet, despite all the progress, the fight was far from over. The legal system, like any institution, was slow to change, and resistance still lingered in places that weren't so easily reached. Marissa knew that true change wasn't going to happen overnight. It was going to take years of effort, persistence, and constant vigilance. But that didn't diminish her resolve. One particularly tense afternoon, Marissa found herself sitting in her office, reviewing a report from the task force's first round of findings. She had worked late into the night, and now, the papers before her felt like a reflection of everything she had fought for. The numbers were startling, revealing clear patterns of bias in everything from sentencing to hiring practices within the department. But it was the personal accounts, stories of people who had been unfairly judged or overlooked, that made her heart heavy. It was a stark reminder of why this fight mattered. She sat back in her chair and glanced at the clock. It was nearly time for the next big meeting, one that would include not only the task force members, but also some of the city's top legal officials. This was the moment they had all been working toward, the presentation of their findings and the official proposal for implementing lasting reforms. Marissa stood, took a deep breath, and straightened her blazer. She knew the presentation wouldn't be easy. There would be skeptics, and there would be those who were resistant to change. But she had made it this far, and she wasn't about to stop now. The meeting room was larger than usual, filled with city leaders and senior judges, all of whom were gathered to hear the task force's findings. As she entered, the room fell silent for a moment, and Marissa felt the weight of their gazes. She stood tall, her eyes scanning the room. She was no longer just a voice in the background. She was a leader, someone who had earned her place at this table. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "Today, we're here to talk about something that many of us have known, but been reluctant to confront. The findings we're about to present show that bias is embedded in the very systems we work within. But the good news is, we now have a chance to change that." She paused to let her words settle before continuing. "This task force has spent the last several months identifying key areas where bias impacts our work. We've looked at data, we've heard personal testimonies, and we've examined policies. And what we found is clear. If we want to create a legal system that is truly just, we have to change how we think, how we act, and how we make decisions. This means adopting comprehensive training, revising hiring practices, and most importantly, holding ourselves accountable for the biases we carry, whether we are conscious of them or not." As Marissa spoke, She saw nods of agreement from some and skeptical frowns from others. But the important thing was that they were listening, truly listening. The task force had done its work, and now Marissa was presenting the case for reform with the kind of certainty that only comes from experience and conviction. At the end of her presentation, she invited Judge Winters to speak. He stood up, his voice low but authoritative. "I've been part of this system for a long time," he began, "and I'll admit, I've always thought that the system worked, that we were doing the best we could. But Ms. Harris is right. There are blind spots. We've all been blind to them. Today, I am committed to supporting the recommendations and pushing for change, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the only thing we can do." The room was quiet as he spoke, and for the first time, Marissa saw the room not as a battleground, but as a place of possibility. She had started with a single conversation, a single step toward confronting the bias that had been ignored for too long. And now she was standing at the threshold of real, transformative change. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was one she would walk with resolve, knowing that the future was not just something to wait for, it was something she was helping to create. And in that moment, as the room erupted into cautious applause, Marissa realized that the fight was far from over, but it was a fight worth winning.